how can the welfare state be designed, redesigned, reframed to help with the new kind of transitions, because the welfare, what is the welfare state for usually? What is the traditional conception of the welfare state? Actually, it's to support difficult transitions, which could be illness, could be old age, could be loss of jobs. So those are the traditional kind of transitions for which the welfare state has been developed, let's say, starting in the early 20th century, something even before, in the late 19th century in some countries, but it developed in full bloom in what the scholars call the 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years of development of the welfare state, which is between the 1950s and late post-war year, late 40s and through the early 80s, when in most, particularly West European countries, the welfare state developed as at its most, let's say. But although everybody thinks to know what the welfare state is, actually, both in theory and practice, there are different ideas and goals attached to the concept of welfare state and also to the practice of welfare state. So for someone, the welfare state should target its goal on supporting the living standards. So whatever are your living standards in a stratified, in an equal society, you should be protected in order to keep your living standard, not to decrease inequalities in living standards, but to keep them. So to each one according not to its needs, but to its status, we could say. For others, the target of the welfare state should be promoting equality, so reducing inequality, which is totally different from supporting the living standard. For somebody else, is smoothing the market failure, so it is more to address the risks which come from the fact that the market is not always functioning perfectly, as we know very well. For still others, which is different from promoting equality and reducing inequality, the welfare state must be mostly targeted to the poor, those who have an adequate income or are well off should take care of themselves without going to the welfare state. So the welfare state should be only for the poor. Still others, and which is a more recent approach, is the target of the welfare state is to support human capital development and to protect from human capital depreciation. So we could summarize all these different ideas, which sometimes are combined, is that the welfare state could be conceived as a piggy bank. You know what a piggy bank is? Piggy bank is a metaphor which is taken from the piggy bank is what we give to children, which is a pig with a hole in it where the children can put their money. So it's to save from, in order to protect from social risks, or could be a Robin Hood that is taking from the rich to give to the poor, or what actually in practice happens is each welfare state has a more or less balanced approach which combines the two, that is protecting the living standards, so protecting each from its own social risk, and also reducing somewhat inequality, and therefore also protecting the poor. But even if we agree that the welfare state has to protect individuals from the social risk, including the social risk of being treated too much unequally, or to suffer from too much inequality or from poverty, exactly what are the risks and the inequalities that should be addressed is always a matter of political choice. So we could say that we all agree that the welfare state should protect from social risks. Why do I use the expression social risks? Because not only I, scholars use this expression social risks in order to point to those risks which derive not from individual choices. So if you are if you take the risk of flying or diving or playing or being a gambler, etc., that is your problem. So it's not that kind of problem. Or if you give all you bet all your money on something that does not win. The social risks are those risks which are socially structured, so depend not on your choices, but on how, for instance, the labor market works, or how the financial market works, or on how having a child is framed as a liability, for instance, and so forth. So when we use the term of social risk, we already allude to the fact that there are risks which are much more dependent on the working of particular systems than on your own will or choice or preferences. Okay, so but exactly what risks are individuated or selected as worthy of being protected from, and what kind of inequalities should be addressed through the welfare state, is always a matter of political choice. So, for instance, what we see in the history, and to some degree even now, of mature welfare states, is that adult and older males are normally more protected than young males and women of all ages. That loss of unemployment is more protected than lack of employment and of poverty. The standard work is usually more protected than non-standard one. And we see it also now with the COVID-19 crisis, that of course those who are losing or are at risk with their jobs, but they belong to the core labor force, have regular contracts and so on, are more protected than those who are losing the jobs, having precarious or temporary jobs. Old age, usually more protected through the pension system than disability. Older people are usually more protected than children. Why this? Because the welfare state originally developed out of a concern for the risks and also the contestation of workers, industrial workers mostly, and which were mostly it is the core workers which were the first category to be protected. And this is why the welfare state developed together with and contributed to the standardization of the male life course in industrial society, with the setting of a minimum age of entering the labor market, and a maximum age at which you can stay in the labor market. So somebody has spoken of an institutionalization of the life course in industrial welfare state society. So in its classical form, the welfare state was largely based on the male breadwinner, female carer family model. What does it mean? It was based on the idea, and to some degree on the practice, but the idea was stronger than the practice, that there was a family, that there is the family, and the family is based on a couple, a heterosexual couple, in which the male is the breadwinner, that is, the male has the responsibility to earn the money for the needs of the family, while the woman is responsible mainly for all the domestic, but also care work towards children, the elderly, and so. And the two things are important. So it's not so the male can enter the labor market because many of his needs and the needs of his children are taken care of by somebody else. So it is free. The worker, male worker, is perceived and defined as being freed from other responsibilities other than earning. Okay, than earning, and therefore the woman symmetrically has those responsibilities. Of course, when this
Professor Saraceno,
I don't see.
Sorry, you were freezing. Now you're back. So we lost probably the last couple of sentences.
But do you see my PowerPoint?
Yes. Now
well,
I
don't see because I don't see it any longer. So this is okay.
Okay.
Here I am. Okay. So I was speaking about the male breadwinner. That is it. Okay. Yes. What do we mean by a welfare state which is based on a family which is organized around the male breadwinner and the female carer? We mean that there is the idea that the society is organized in families which are based on a heterosexual couple, that is a man and a woman, and children, and that the role of the man is to earn money to pay for the needs of himself, but also his wife and children, while the role of the woman is to provide all the unpaid work which is necessary for the man to be able to exit the household and go to work, and for children to be raised properly and taken care of, and sometimes also the frail relatives and so on and so forth. So originally, this explains why the male core workers were so much better protected than women, and also the young men, because all the protection was rooted in the position of the male breadwinner, on his responsibilities as the earner and also as the distributor of protection to the other members of the family. But this, at the same time, created gender arrangements which were very asymmetrical, not only in terms of power, but in terms of division of labor, and also in terms of the possibility of women to enter the labor market. Not all welfare states, of course, are the same. I don't have the time to give you a full description of the why differences, because I want to go to the focus of this lesson. I just want to point out that there are quite important cross-national differences, as well as cross-time differences in not only in the kind of social risks which have been protected. So, for instance, today there are welfare states which are less male breadwinner centered than others, and also less old people skewed towards old people than others. But here what I want to point out is that even in the degree to which they are efficient in the redistribution, in the degree of the redistribution, therefore, in the degree to which they are able to reduce inequalities, there are important differences, and these differences do not depend only on the level of the GDP. Of course, richer countries can redistribute more in principle than poorer countries. But what is interesting is that even at the same or equivalent level, GDP level, we see quite different patterns and efficiency of redistribution. And this depends, as I mentioned before, on the different ways of conceiving welfare state goals. So welfare states which are more based on the idea of supporting the level of living and the social stratification as it is, are less redistributive than welfare states which have more a goal of reducing inequality. But also these differences in the efficiency and efficacy in reducing inequality depend also on the specific combination of patterns of social spending with regard to beneficiaries. So supporting more pensioners than working age people, or privileging cash transfer rather than services, and also the role of taxation. So there are so the composition of the welfare state is very important. And here I just show you two figures which I have taken from other scholars. This one is taken by Esping Andersen and Miles, I think, and which shows the percentage decline in income inequality according to welfare state expenditure. And we see that, yes, that the more you spend, the more there is a reduction in inequality, but at the same time, it is not so linear. So Denmark and the Czech Republic are more able, are less able, more able than France and Germany to reduce inequality. Okay, and the other one, no, only one. Yes, only this one I showed. Okay, having said this is the background, very, very synthetic and to some degree very reductive. But what I want to arrive at is the emergence of the new social risks. So the traditional social risks, as I said before, which were the target of the welfare state, were old age, illness, and unemployment. Unemployment meaning loss of employment, not lack of employment. So loss of employment and also invalidity due to work accidents. in the 80s and 90s, a whole literature started to be developed around the concept of new social risks. I am ambivalent with this category because some of these new, so-called new social risks actually are old social risks, but they are new in the way in that they are perceived as such. So before they were not perceived as such, and now they are perceived as such, also because they are more widespread. Some of them instead are maybe newer. And these new, so-called new social risks emerge both at the labor market level and at the family and gender arrangement level. And you could also add at the individual, but the individual crosses these two dimensions. At the labor market level, what happens, particularly starting in the 90s, late 20th century, and clearly at present, it is after a long period in which, particularly in the most developed countries, labor contracts became increasingly regularized and stabilized. There has been a trend reversal, and precarity, intermittent labor markets, job insecurity started to increase again. There is, and this is the first new social risk. Of course, even before there were precarious intermittent workers, but they were perceived as being marginal. That is, even to some degree in a diminishing social group. What is clear now is that they are not marginal. Yes, they are marginal in terms of social protection, but they are not marginal in terms of numbers, and they are also increasing. A second, and I find this always funny, but a second social risk, which is very much focused on, is the increasing presence of women in the labor market with carrying responsibilities. That is, mass entrance of women in the labor market, and particularly what happened since the 90s, is that it is mothers who enter or who remain, even when they become mothers, in the labor market. And this is a novelty in the industrial society. It was not a novelty in the rural society, but it becomes a novelty in the industrial society. It is that women with heavy carrying responsibility are now present in the labor market. And therefore, this is perceived, having a child is perceived as a social risk. That is a risk for the ability of women to be and remain in the labor market. This is why I find it a bit paradoxical. Having a child was never perceived as a risk for men. Actually, it was perceived even as strengthening their position in the labor market because they had to provide. But for women, it's perceived as a risk given the way it is, the labor market is organized. Another social risk, which this is probably new, although probably in the original industrialization it was present in a different way, is that the technological development creates or causes de-skilling. So workers who were perfectly adequate up to a certain point were efficient work and so on, with the introduction of new technologies become obsolete. And there is an increasing dualization created by technological development among workers. Another growing phenomenon is in-work poverty, that is being poor notwithstanding having a job. So at the family level, marriage instability, it was always, it's even this is funny to call it, to define it a new social risk. Women and children have always been vulnerable to poverty in case of widowhood or losing the father, because of the organization of the family and of the marginality or absence of mothers from the labor market. But with the increasing divorce rate and individualization in the relationship, marriage instability becomes a risk of poverty for a growing number of women and children if women are not in the labor market or have difficulty in remaining in the labor market because of the gender division of labor. Another social risk which is defined as such is the fertility decline. That is not so much a risk for the individuals, or those which I have mentioned before is a risk which are suffered by individuals and families. The fertility decline is a risk which is perceived as such at the societal level because of the inability of a society to reproduce itself, of the aging of the population, because if there is an increasing life expectancy, and this is a good thing, because we are better and also we live longer, but at the same time there is a fertility decline, the population becomes older and older, and this increases the costs on the welfare state. For instance, the health costs, the pension costs, and so on and so forth. At the family level, women's labor force participation is perceived as a social risk because if women are in the labor market, they cannot be at the same time with the same intensity as before in family work, in caring work, unpaid caring work. And so there is a concern about a possible care deficit. So this is at the family level. Of course, because it is expected that women provide, not that maybe men and so on. At the individual life course level, in addition to those which I mentioned before, the fact that that the majority of people live longer, live long, not only longer, but long, and therefore old age, that is being over 70 and now increasing over 80, is becoming not an exception, but also a normal thing, includes or brings with it the risk of becoming frail. So there is a life course stage which was not so widespread 50 years ago, when there were fewer very old people about. That is the life stage in which one is frail, is not totally self-sufficient, therefore needs support in order to go on living adequately. In the face of these new social risks, there have been two approaches concerning how the welfare state should be redesigned in order to be more adequate to the new situation. One, which probably you have heard of because it's very famous, and now it belongs even to the political jargon as common sense, is the social investment approach. And as being Anderson, I have many typos, mistakes. Emerita, the EU uses this word very much. And the second approach, which is not totally alternative, but is somewhat different as a different focus, is the transitional labor market approach, which is Schmidt, Suppiot, among others. And then there is, which is not a totally, let's say, is a new approach, but has not the ambition to reframe the welfare state as such. It's just wants to introduce a new important item in the welfare state, but not redesigning the whole welfare state, which is the basic income approach, of which you first probably have heard of. Let's say the social investment approach. Here the focus is on human capital. So since the risk is that risk comes from technological development, from precarity in the labor market, what is important is to provide each individual from start with all the possible resources in order to develop and improve his or her human capital, in order to be able to face all the changes which can happen in the labor market. So to be trained, retrained, and so on, to be according to this approach, the welfare state has three main functions. One is strengthening the stock, and speaking of the labor market mostly, strengthening the stock, the human capital, so education, long life learning. What is important in this approach is that they focus also very much on children, so they are very strong supporters of early child education since very early, since the very first years, because the international literature agrees on the fact that the first 1,000 days are a crucial time for the overall development of an individual, and one should invest very much in those first years, and of course also later on. But if one does not invest well in the first years, investing later is not as efficient. And the second function of the welfare state is easing the flow of labor market and life course transition, so which means active labor market policies, pushing and persuading people to find jobs, helping them to find jobs, but also helping people, particularly women, to keep and to take a job with work-family conciliation policy, so care services, leaves, and so on and so forth. Originally, in the social investment approach, only the two dimensions were pointed out. But then in the discussion, they said, of course, is not enough, because something can happen in life, and whatever, even if one is very active, very attentive to keep up his human capital and so on, it can happen something. And so one needs support, and also becoming old, one cannot always keep on working and being active. And so they add that even the third function of the welfare state is to maintain strong minimum income safety nets as economic stabilization buffer. So unemployment indemnities, minimum income for the poor, pension, and so on. So we have investing in human capital is not an alternative in providing a floor of income protection. The transitional labor market approach is slightly different, although sometimes it uses also the language of social investment, particularly more recently. But its main objective, and it's interesting for our topic today, is exactly to support life course transitions and what Schmidt calls decoupling all the transitions which are very time intensive and time and investment intensive. So the reasoning goes like this. In the traditional life course, particularly for men, but increasingly also for women, there are stages of life in which everything must be done very intensively, but also in tension with each other. So one has to form the family, having a child, invest in the job, starting the career, and so on. And so as to put all its investment into many things. So what they and which is not very efficient, and therefore, so can happen that the men invest in their career, and women then invest in having the children, and they do not meet, or their life course diverge. So what they think is that the welfare state should provide a system which helps, so a set of measures which helps people to remain in the labor market, but also to take a distance from the labor market when it is necessary. So to go in and out, or being intensively in, but and then less intensively in, depending on the life course stage he or she is. Out of this approach, policies have been developed trying to put in practice this approach, which is flexi-security. That is, for instance, in Denmark, which is the country where it has been most developed. So where there is a strong emphasis on being active and being in the labor market, but at the same time, entering and leaving a job is not something dramatic. So there is also, because there is a very rich, there was, I don't know now, very rich and active labor market. It is more difficult where the labor market is more static and less rich. Anyway, this flexi-security means that you have an income support measure which helps you to, in your transition, going from one job to another, or going in a job and then exiting to go back in learning, and so on. And also working time banks are very interesting, so that you can decide. They try to put that in practice in the Netherlands as part of the contract in the medium-sized and large enterprises, so that you can decide how much to work during the year, and then you work more 1 year or 1 month, and then you work less the other year and the other month. More recently, Schmidt speaks of putting in place a kind of life course insurance. That is, instead of speaking of only of an unemployment insurance, a life course insurance, that is a system which supports your income in different kind of transition, including the transition to take care of a child or to take care of a frail old or so on. In this approach, they also think of having new social rights. So there are not only new social risks, but also new social rights. So there is not only the right to education, which is part of the traditional democratic society, but a right to lifelong learning, so all during, and retraining. This is very similar to what also the social investment approach speaks about. Also, the right to appropriate working hours, it is the right to negotiate a working time more attuned to your necessity in your particular life stage, to a family life, to occupation, quindi you are not only a worker, to occupational redeployment, to retraining and rehabilitation. And there is this idea that there should be also an employment of last resort through the state. This is also an idea which a very important British economist, Tony Atkinson, spoke about in his last book, which was entitled Inequality. And he speaks about it. So there should be, the right to work should be guaranteed as a last instance also through the state. Of course, not fake work, but there are so many jobs and work to be done that they should be provided by the state as a last resort. The universal basic income proposal, it has different forms and arguments. Here I present mostly that by Fan Paris, but there are others as well. So in most proposals, it is not a total substitution for welfare arrangements, and it's not also intended to provide a full income so that you do not need to go and work in most proposal. The idea is that rich societies are rich enough to provide a basic income that is a threshold, a minimum threshold, without any additional requirement. That is, everybody gets it without having to give something back in exchange. Because this would enlarge the freedom of choice. So you are not obliged to take any dirty, unpaid, bad job just because you do not have an alternative. You can decide how many hours to work and so on and so forth. So the idea is that a basic income should be, like say, a new social right to enlarge the freedom of choice. This was the original idea of the basic income. With the increasing precarity in the labor market, what happens is that now many of the supporters of the basic income argue in favor of the basic income, not so much in terms of, or not only, in terms of enlarging the freedom of choice, but saying, okay, the labor market is increasingly unable to give everybody an income adequate enough for a decent living. Therefore, let's say, a basic income should be provided in order to help people not to become poor, notwithstanding they work, or notwithstanding they would want to work. So the increasing precarity and the increasing experience of in-work poverty is a more recent driver in the back of the proposal of the basic income. Of course, this idea of the basic income has caused an immense debate, particularly on moral grounds. So why should everybody get something even if they don't anything worthy of? There is this figure of the surfer. Why should the surfer in California, on the beach in California, get a basic income? What is the use? What is not doing anything useful for society? So why should society provide for him? So somebody says, like Atkinson say, no, so the surfer not, if he does not do anything else useful, but student, whoever, mother, so whoever does something useful, even going to school or taking care, etc., they should have. So what Atkinson speaks of participation income. Fan Paris and others say, wait, this is a moralistic approach. So it's a very interesting debate. If you are interested in this, you could look it up. But what is interesting is that notwithstanding this debate, the idea that some kind of basic income maybe is less out of any reasonable prevision is coming forth. Even a few weeks ago, even on The Economist, on the journal The Economist, there was, which is not a very radical journal, I don't remember the name, but there was somebody saying, after all, maybe this is in the face of the crisis of the loss of job because of also of the COVID-19, maybe instead of giving bits and pieces, different income support measure to different kind of people, thinking about a basic income for everybody could be the most reasonable and even rational thing, maybe even most efficient because it's less bureaucratic. It was interesting to find this kind of reasoning in the face of the new social risks which have emerged with the COVID-19 crisis. I want to finish with a different perspective, which you probably have found in in the paper which was distributed. All these proposals of redesigning the welfare state, reorienting the welfare state, are all discussion about how to redesign, reframe, retarget the distribution, redistribution part, because the welfare state is about redistribution. Could be redistribution within categories or across categories, but it's always a redistribution. There has been a discussion started about 15 years ago, although it is older. Everything has been to some degree already thought many times ago, but it's been reframed in recent times, which, without denying the role of redistribution, so it does not deny the role of the welfare state, but what this approach says is that as long as we do not change the way wealth and income is distributed, the welfare state will always have to react to inequalities which are produced at the distributive level. Well, maybe it would be efficient from the point of view of reducing some risk and reducing some unacceptable or dangerous inequalities, to promote market reforms that encourage a more equal distribution of economic power, income, assets, rewards, without waiting for the compensation ex post. And this approach is called pre-distribution. Probably should be called distribution, but since it is a redistribution, it's called pre-distribution. So pre-distribution seeks to restructure the market economy, ensuring that there are fairer outcomes for all, without, of course, sacrificing long-term growth and productivity. So it's not that everybody should get the same, but should be fair. Should be fairer than it is. And you probably know, or if you don't know, I tell you that inequality, both in income and wealth, in the past 20 years has increased enormously in the world, but particularly in the developed world. That is the distance between the richest and the poorest, but also between the richest and the middle one has increased enormously. And it's not only in wealth, but also in income. Just think of the income the CEO, the CEO, or income of the big up managers and so on and so forth, who are paid not only wages, but also through stocks and so on and so forth. So, without any explanation in terms of the added, that is with regard to the magnitude of the added value they attach because of their work. So the aim of the pre-distributive market design is to eliminate biases that benefit privileged groups, including men towards women, promoting public interest objectives that reduce the need for post hoc compensation. With the social investment approach is concerned very much with education and lifelong learning and early child education, but also and with equal opportunities from start, but is also concerned with contrasting too much inequalities also in outcomes, because the social investment approach thinks that if we set everybody on equal foot from start, then they can run their course and go on their life. What this approach, but also people like Atkinson and others say, well, actually, also during the running, something can happen, which is also structured. So if you are a black and a white society, if you are a disabled, if you are a woman, and so on and so forth, it can happen that you start equal, but then they render you, the society, the mechanism, make you unequal as you go. And therefore, also, these should be taken care of, not only ex post in terms of compensation, but as intervention on the mechanism. And with this, I have finished. No.
Thank you very much.
There is another one, the COVID. I had another one. So just to finish with what happened with the COVID pandemic, has it changed the context of this kind of discussion? Yes and no. Yes, certainly what has emerged is that the role of a public welfare state is very important, particularly in the terms of health, everybody knows, particularly comparing Europe, particularly Western Europe, with the United States, where that is countries with a public health system and the countries without a public health system. It is clear that, for instance, the risk of taking the COVID is differently addressed, and the possibility to be cured is different. But also with regard to the loss of work and income, all the countries, including the United States, have had to redistribute money because in order to take care of the loss of work of income, but also the importance of school and research has emerged in the care. So everybody now, at least in Europe, I don't know in the United States, agrees on the fact that the public sector welfare state is very important, but at the same time, what has emerged is also that there has been incredible increase of inequalities, and therefore whether it is enough, what there is not clear. Thank you.